Also, there's, of course, an element of improvisation that was going on in the way ragtime was being played in New Orleans, whereas when we think of classic ragtime, it's a written style. You were taking the sheet music home with you, going into the parlor, and playing it as written. It was mostly music for the home, to entertain yourself, to entertain guests at home, whereas here it was predominantly being played as dance music in dance halls, and it was also, of course, being played in the Storyville district, in the sporting houses. And let's see. So while ragtime matured in other regions, its development stopped at the folk level in the South, and the publishing companies in New Orleans, it kind of ended around 1910 here, whereas rags were still being published even into the early 20s, although it had started to fall out of popularity by then. But certainly it was still going strong, you know, at least 5, 6, 7 years after the publishing companies here basically stopped publishing them. And you know, America at large was going through one pop revolution, ragtime, whereas the South was undergoing 3 simultaneously, ragtime, blues, and jazz. So that kind of diverted attention away from strict ragtime, ragtime with the capital R here. So we can talk a little bit about the stylists. And now the South had all the same ingredients for ragtime: cakewalks, folk melodies, minstrel shows, and we had plenty of venues that could accommodate. But the players down here refused to accept the St. Louis classicism. They were able to recognize that the Maple Leaf Rag was a great piece of music, but it wasn't Holy Writ, and you could find dozens and dozens of Maple Leaf Rag imitations being published, and I guess this was a time before you would sue somebody for obviously stealing your melody. And this will bring me to my first example, just to give you an example of that. There was only one rag that was published in the South that was one of these Maple Leaf Rag imitations, and it actually came from Memphis in 1915, and it's something called the Fuzzy Wuzzy Rag. Let's talk a little bit about the piano players. Of course, that was Jelly Roll Morton. He's the most well-known and most recorded of the piano players that were playing in New Orleans in the first decade of the 20th century. I think had he grown up in St. Louis or Chicago or New York, he would have become a classic rag composer. He really loved Scott Joplin. He loved James Scott. But he was here in New Orleans and was exposed to all the different elements of what became New Orleans jazz, and so he became Jelly Roll Morton, of course. But his favorite piano players were really diverse pianists, He referred to them as good manipulators of several musical styles. People like Tony Jackson, Sammy Davis, Albert Carroll, Alfred Wilson. Unfortunately, none of those people were recorded, but we do have the Library of Congress recordings that he recorded with Alan Lomax in the late 30s, and he gave some pretty good, or I assume pretty good, imitations of these piano players, and we'll check a little bit of that out in just a second. And none of these people wrote down or published a rag. Actually, it was mostly amateurs who published rags down in the South. And ragtime was simply on a list of several styles that could be improvised on in their own unique styles. And that was a big thing. Each player had to have their own style. And let me play a little bit of, I'll play a little bit of Jelly Roll Morton imitating Sammy Davis.
For a little illustration of Sammy Davis, I will see if I can imitate it just a bit. I only remember a little bit. Of course, it's been years since I've seen Sammy. Yeah, that's considered ragtime. That was one of his styles, so most everybody had a different style.
See, that was considered ragtime. They'll mention Frog Legs Rag, which is a great rag by James Scott that was published in 1906. And if they talk about Frog Legs Rag, you could hear that every week in New Orleans, probably played a little bit differently. So we'll give Frog Legs Rag a try here.
Version of your own creation.
Yes. Before we do this, I should just explain maybe the process in doing this. You know, learn the piece first, learn the melody, right? Learn what the chord changes are. You know, a lot of times when people learn a rag, or they learn it like a piece of classical music, they're learning to read it exactly as written. But go through, figure out what is the harmony of the tune. I like to write the chord changes down, just learn it even better. Of course, the main difference is the feel of the tune. You can hear the difference between the sweet band playing and the ragtime band, Bunk Johnson's band playing. Went from straight to a more swinging feel. I like to try and find similarities in the compositions themselves with recorded examples of New Orleans music. So, for example, the third strain of this rag, I'd like to compare it to the third strain of Jelly Roll Morton's Mamanita. It's a little bit similar harmonically, and you could treat it the same way, with a little bit of a Latin tinge, as Morton would have called it. Find, what are the real important parts of the melody, and where can you have a little bit of leeway. Oftentimes it's at the ends of phrases that you'll have a little bit more leeway. We tend to, when we think of a melody of a tune, it's always the beginnings of the phrases that we can identify first. The turnarounds and things like that, I don't know why, but those things seem to be less memorable. Where can you find breaks in a tune? Morton talks about the importance of breaks, and there are obvious places in these rags. You heard in that Maple Leaf rag where Morton plays a break. Where can you apply? Jelly Roll Morton is the best recorded example of an early New Orleans pianist. How can I use some of his left-hand devices? He liked to use sixths a lot. He liked to use these trombone-like lines in his left hand. Where can I insert that in? Of course, these are things you want to be learning anyway as a stylist, and hopefully these things just come out naturally in your playing, and it's not an exact arrangement every time. And you want to try and change textures between sections. This was a big thing for Morton. For example, have you all heard the Pearls by Jelly Roll Morton? That's such a great example of the texture changes between within a composition. Where can you find room to improvise more? Can you include the Spanish tinge sort of thing? How can you end the tune? A lot of New Orleans musicians like to use these things called double endings. I'm sure maybe a lot of you have already heard about that. Or you could do play it straight out. You could use a double ending. You could tag the ending of it. We'll see how we end this one when we get to it. And just some things to think about. All right, now I'll play. Frog Legs Rag.
I'm sorry we've run out of time.
Oh, darn. Al Smith on drums. That will do it for me.